On November 6th, we submitted the 2008 Quality of Life Report just to begin to develop the context and a framework for the discussions that will follow. This afternoon we'll provide an overview of some of the material in the report. The Quality of Life Report is an objective quantitative analysis of our community and its place among similarly situated American cities. And of course, everywhere we turn today we see new lists of best and worst cities. But those kind of popular rankings are often quite subjective, as illustrated by the assertions that Tulsa is both one of the very best places to live and, quote, one of the absolutely worst places to live in America. The Quality of Life Report is based on objective and consistent data, and it's a comprehensive review covering the spectrum of issues related to our community's quality of life and touching on all the services provided by municipal government. Of course, the landscape is shifting daily, and we'll only really be able to see a complete picture out of the rearview mirror, but we've tried to provide a thorough analysis of where we are and where we've been and how we stack up to other cities. But before we get into the material, I'd like to say just a few words about the methodology. The report is based on measures that were developed from an extensive review of outcome-based performance measurement used in other cities. And based on that research, council staff identified 8 key areas of quality of life, and some of those are broken down further into subcomponents. And for each of these, staff developed representative and consistently available data and gathered the most current data for 20 comparison cities. For these kind of us versus them comparisons, the data include everything from commute times to crime rates to healthcare costs. And those measures were then standardized and then mathematically grouped into one of 5 categories. And once we compare ourselves to the other cities, then we drill down a little further and supplement those findings with data illustrating trends in Tulsa over time. And the comparison cities were selected based on 2,000 central city populations from the U.S. Census clustered immediately above and below Tulsa. And 5 cities were added for regional comparisons. So to begin, again, this is an outline of the model. And after all the data collection and the calculations, this is how we fared relative to our comparison cities. You can see that we did best in the areas of transportation, neighborhood vitality, especially housing affordability, culture, and citizen engagement. And I think that generally tracks with our perception of our city. It's pretty easy to get around, it's a relatively affordable place, and we're pretty actively engaged in civic affairs and cultural events. We did worse in the areas of recreation and human investment. And this, too, tracks with what we perceive about ourselves, specifically that we're probably not as active and healthy as we might be. And we'll dig a little deeper into each of these in just a minute. If we compare those relative ratings over time, we can see that our transportation, public safety, and environmental indicators are improving, while our employment, recreation, and human investment indicators are declining. And again, keep in mind that these ratings are all relative to the comparison cities, so a drop might reflect other cities' improvement as much as it reflects a decline in Tulsa. And it might also reflect a slowing of growth rather than an absolute decline. For example, I think that's the case with regard to our employment indicators. Before we get into each of the quality of life components, I'd like to review a few demographic trends. You can see that we were one of just 3 of the 20 comparison cities to lose population in the last 7 years. We experienced significant job losses and population decline from 2001 to 2003, which you'll notice as we proceed show up in just about all of our quality of life indicators. For the last 2 years, we've finally begun to see modest population growth again, according to census estimates. Tulsa's and Oklahoma City's populations have grown fairly steadily since statehood, though Tulsa's population has experienced slightly larger fluctuations. Our populations have begun to diverge, however. From 19 1980 to 2007, Tulsa's population grew by about 6%, while Oklahoma City's population grew by more than 35%. Just as significantly, the population gap between the city of Tulsa and our largest suburbs has narrowed since the 1970s. Since 1970, the city's population has grown by about 12%, while the suburbs' population has grown by more than 300%. Today, the city currently represents about 42% of the MSA population. Tulsa County residents approaching retirement age are far and away the fastest growing segment of our population, and at the same time we're seeing a decrease in residents age 10 to 44. And this demographic shift, of course, will present some workforce challenges as well as some transportation and human service delivery challenges in the years ahead. But the same trend regionally and nationally may also present some opportunities to market Tulsa's relatively low cost of living and quality of life to retirees from outside the city and the region. As we saw during the discussion on streets, Tulsa was a much smaller city geographically in the early 1960s, and as we've annexed large areas since with relatively little population, our land area has grown 7 times faster than our population since 1950. In the last 40 years, both our population and land area have grown only modestly, so the ratio of people per square mile remains pretty low, fewer than 2,000 people per square mile. And while our land area increased dramatically in 1966, Tulsa has actually developed and urbanized in a pattern of accretion largely south and east of downtown. And since 1970, the bulk of Tulsa's greenfield development has occurred south of 61st Street and east of Mingo Road. And that pattern is evident as well in the history of residential development in Tulsa. With those demographic trends as a backdrop, now we'll take a closer look at each of the quality of life elements. Recent employment and income indicators place us in the middle group among our peer cities, so our composite economic vitality rating is average. Employment in our area remains strong, holding steady after rebounding from the declines of 2001 through 2003. And our service economy continues to drive employment in the area, but employment in goods-producing industries has grown faster than service sector employment in the last 3 years, largely on the strength of our oil and gas and manufacturing industries. While the Tulsa area experienced more substantial employment declines than the rest of the state and the nation in the early part of this decade, we've seen more significant growth in recent years, but that rate of growth is now beginning to recede. Of course, Tulsans looking for work continue to enjoy a generally favorable job market, and employers continue to work hard to attract quality applicants. The city's unemployment rate has hovered just slightly above the unemployment rate in the state and the metro area, but it's considerably lower than in June of 03 when it reached 7.5%. The chart on the screen shows the average rate for the full year. It actually reached as high as 7.5% in the summer of 03. And these are the year-to-date unemployment figures. In April, unemployment in the city of Tulsa fell to 2.8%, which is the lowest rate in nearly 8 years. Our median household income of just over $38,000 is about 75% of the national median household income of nearly $51,000. Our median income declined from 02 to 06, but increased in 2007. And our per capita income has increased slowly but steadily since 2003. While our median income is about 3/4 of the national median, our cost of living is also lower, about 78% of the national average, largely because housing in Tulsa is still substantially less expensive than much of the rest of the country. 14% of city households earn more than $100,000 per year, and 1/3 of Tulsa households earn less than $25,000 per year. Looking at retail sales, the city's share of taxable retail sales in the MSA has fallen from 74% to 63% in the past decade. Last year, retail sales grew nearly 4% in the city, but they grew nearly twice as fast in the MSA and in the state. Of course, energy prices affect just about every aspect of our economy, from transportation and consumer spending to manufacturing. But we might be hedged a little better than much of the rest of the country in this regard, since oil and gas development is still a significant aspect of our economy. But high energy prices aren't an unmitigated advantage. Another large segment of our local economy is significantly disadvantaged by high fuel prices. And you can see this reflected in a comparison of some locally important stocks to oil prices. While there tends to be a direct relationship between the value of oil and the value of local energy companies such as Helmerich & Payne and Williams, there tends to be an inverse relationship between the price of oil and the fate of, for example, American Airlines. Just at the moment, we're still experiencing some negative impacts in the aerospace industry, but at the same time, we're anticipating that a drop in oil prices will have negative effects on the oil and gas industry, so we're starting to see that pendulum swing back. Recent public safety indicators place us in the middle group of our peer cities. Property crime has declined each year since 2003, and violent crime has declined since 2005. And I think this slide is helpful for another reason, in that it puts the relative prevalence of violent crimes in some perspective. You can see that property crimes are actually 5 times more prevalent than violent crimes in the city. This is a breakdown of all index crimes, which are crimes reported to the FBI on a regular basis since 1995. And you can see that there was a significant spike in our crime rate, largely attributable to a 27% increase in larcenies from 2000 to 2003. Burglaries are up about 27% since 2000, but they're not that far out of line with the burglary rate in the late 1990s. I think this is one of the more interesting trends in the report. This shows total crime, the orange line, superimposed on a trend line showing correlation doesn't imply causation. It's interesting to think about the relationship between our economic well-being and public safety. Shown another way, we can see that there is, in fact, a pretty strong positive correlation between unemployment and crime in the city. You can see that the nature of the fire service has changed pretty dramatically in the last 25 years. Fighting structure fires today represents about 1.5% of what the fire department does on an annual basis. While structure fires have declined by nearly 30% since 1982, rescue and EMS responses have increased by nearly 4,000%. And in 2007, TFD responded to about 800 structure fires, but they responded to nearly 33,000 rescue and emergency medical calls. At the same time, IMSA's workload has continued to increase. Priority 1 responses in the Eastern Division have increased by more than 130% just since 2000. Taking a look at neighborhood vitality, as I mentioned earlier, ours is a very affordable housing market relative to our peer cities. Our trends put us in the above average category. Our neighborhood stability indicators are not quite as strong, just average, but our composite neighborhood vitality rating is still above average. Nearly 60% of the owner-occupied housing units in the city of Tulsa are valued between $50,000 and $150,000. So while housing in Tulsa is still very affordable, homes in our area have continued to appreciate in price as much of the rest of the nation is experiencing depreciation or slowed growth. For the one-year period ending in the second quarter of this year, our MSA had the 10th highest rate of home price appreciation in the nation, and Oklahoma had the highest rate of home price appreciation of any state, nearly 5%. And according to August figures from the Greater Tulsa Association of Realtors, while the number of residential real estate closings is down about 15% from the same month a year ago, the average sales price has held steady since 2007 and is up about 8% since 2005. And we see that reflected as well in new home construction. New home construction in our MSA has declined significantly since 2005, about 35%, but the average price of those new units continued to climb, rising about 17%. And this is similar to trends in the mid-1980s, 90s, and in 2000, when new housing starts declined as prices continued to rise. Looking at the current year to date, the average value per unit has declined for 2 months now in August and September, but is still on track to end higher than in 2007. There's a higher percentage of renter-occupied housing units in the city than in the nation as a whole, as you might expect in an urban area. According to the Census Bureau, nearly 54,000 City of Tulsa households spend more than 30% of their incomes on housing costs. So while Tulsa might not have been affected as dramatically by foreclosures as other parts of the country, we're not entirely immune from the trends that are affecting neighborhood stability nationwide. In the second quarter of this year, there was one foreclosure for every 222 Tulsa area households, and that's nearly a 70% increase over the same period in 2007. According to an INCOG survey taken this summer, 3/4 of Tulsa area residents value neighborhood appearance and access to medical care when selecting a place to live. 56% of the respondents stated that the quality of public schools is an extremely important consideration in the selection of a home. So looking at relative housing condition, it's generally a good indicator of neighborhood stability and vice versa. And INCOG has recently mapped the county assessor's evaluation of property condition for every single-family residence in the city of Tulsa. Based on these assessments, we can identify some larger areas of substandard housing, such as this area between Apache and 11th Street from Peoria to Delaware. And the point of this map is not to stigmatize these areas, but to provide a basis for taking an honest look at them and thinking about possible budget and policy responses to help improve conditions, such as rebuilding infrastructure, enhancing law enforcement, developing some stabilizing neighborhood institutions, or any number of potential responses to addressing some of these issues. Because the truth of the matter is, substandard housing tends to correlate to other problems. For example, arson rates and domestic violence rates, just to name a few. There's also a large area of housing in below average condition between 36th and 66th Street North. West Tulsa is kind of interesting for the diversity of housing conditions in close proximity. Above average and substandard houses regularly coexist on the same block. And even in relatively stable areas, such as south of 21st Street and east of Garnett, we can see some early signs of declining housing conditions, which might indicate that this area is ripe for stabilization efforts before problems become systemic. And there's a good analogy here to your recent discussions about street maintenance. You had many discussions about the tension and the balancing act between fixing our worst streets first and stabilizing less severe problems before they fall off the PCI curve and become unrepairable. There are probably some similar considerations when it comes to neighborhood stabilization. Our recent health indicators place Tulsa in the middle group of our peer cities, as do recent education trends. But again, since all of these rankings are relative to our comparison cities, our composite human investment ranking is below average. With a few exceptions, Oklahoma's health risk and outcome rankings relative to other states have become significantly worse in the last 2 decades. Our overall health outcome ranking is 47th out of 50, slipping 16 places since 1990. Oklahoma has one of the highest age-adjusted death rates in the nation, and areas of North and West Tulsa have the highest age-adjusted death rates in Tulsa County. And of course, it probably goes without saying at this point, but the OSU Medical Center is centrally located and accessible to the highest concentrations of our poor health indicators. The county has one of the highest heart disease death rates in the nation. And again, areas of North and West Tulsa have the highest heart disease death rates in the county. And the causes of these indicators isn't really a mystery. Oklahoma has among the lowest rates of physical activity and the highest rates of smoking and obesity in the nation. For good measure, we also have among the highest rates of diabetes, stroke deaths, and motor vehicle deaths. Moving on to education, our inner city school systems typically deal with a different set of issues than suburban schools, making direct comparisons difficult. For example, nearly 83% of TPS students are eligible for free or reduced lunches, compared to about 24% in Jinx. While Jinx and Union public schools have higher academic performance index scores than Tulsa and Oklahoma City public schools, the inner city districts have shown the most improvement over the last 4 years. And it's no secret, of course, that there's a significant dropout problem in Oklahoma City's inner city school systems. Graduation rates in Tulsa and Oklahoma City schools are about 20% lower than suburban districts. But that said, graduation rates have improved in Tulsa and Oklahoma City in the last 3 years, as they've declined in Jinx and Union public schools. Our citizen engagement measures are above average. And of course, voter turnout and voter engagement in Tulsa is of course issue dependent and often varies based on what shares the ballot with local issues. But voter turnout in the street tax proposals was remarkable. 60% of all Tulsans over age 18 voted, and that's not 60% of registered voters, that's 60% of all Tulsans. More than 4 times as many people voted in the election than voted in any of the last 3 municipal tax elections. The city of Tulsa is recognized as being a city of active volunteers. In 2007, a report noted recognized the Tulsa area as having the highest number of volunteer hours served annually per resident of any metro area in the nation, 60 hours per year per resident. And annual contributions to the United Way are back up after significant declines in 2003 and 2004. They're up about 15% since 2004, but still lower than 2002 levels. Recent transportation indicators for Tulsa are above average. INCOG's most recent regional transportation survey gauged the prevalence of different modes of transportation, and it's no surprise that the single occupant automobile is the overwhelming choice for Tulsa area commuters. Of the respondents working outside the home, 91% drive alone to and from work, 7% carpool, and fewer than 3% take public transportation. And this is probably one factor contributing to our preference. The average commute time in the area is about 18 minutes, which might sound kind of high to us, but it's quite low compared to other places. Of course, retail gas prices in Tulsa are consistently lower than the U.S. average, but there have been dramatic price spikes over the last 4 years, and those spikes appear to have contributed to a 42% increase in transit ridership since 2005. A 2008 forecast by the University of Tulsa, which was based in part on gas price trends, found that Tulsa Transit may expect to see a 32% increase in fixed route ridership over the next 5 years. With regard to air travel, seating capacity is down at Tulsa International Airport as airlines have canceled flights in response to higher fuel prices. More recent fuel price declines, though, may prompt airlines to begin restoring some flights. As a result of declining capacity, passenger counts are down in the last few months over the same months in 2007. There were 32,000 fewer passengers in September of this year than in September of last year. Environmental indicators for Tulsa are average compared to our peer cities. And this one gets a little bit convoluted, but in essence, while our ground level ozone readings have improved considerably over the last several years, the Tulsa area is in violation of the EPA's new National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone of 0.075 parts per million. This violation means that our entire MSA is potentially eligible for the non-attainment status, which comes with a host of site-specific planning and potential remediation requirements yet to be determined. Finally, Tulsa's recreation indicators place us in the worst category of the 20 comparison cities, but our cultural indicators are above average. Our composite ranking for both recreation and culture then is below average. Entertainment spending in the county has generally tracked changes in employment and other economic indicators. You can see the familiar dip in 2001 to 2003. Tulsa ranks 47th out of 71 park systems in park operating expenditures per resident. We spend about 63% of the national average. Other comparative rankings include these. Number of playgrounds, we rank 22nd out of 73 systems. Ball diamonds, we rank 58th out of 75 park systems. Skateboard parks, 42nd out of 76 systems surveyed. We rank 5th out of 75 park systems in the number of swimming pools, but they attributed 23 swimming pools to Tulsa, and of course only 8 of those were operational. And if we looked at the number of functioning pools, that would place us 43rd out of the 75 park systems.